So let's say we want to call the switch name handler, which I recognized also changes the age, so maybe the name wasn't chosen perfectly. Let's say we want to call that not when clicking this button here, or not only when clicking this button, but also, let's say, when clicking any paragraph here, the paragraph which contains name and age, inside a person component. Now for that, in the person component, we could add on click, but now what? We can't call that handler method, it's in a different file, in a different class. Well, we can actually pass a reference to this handler as a property to our component. And this is no fancy hack. This is actually a very common pattern. I will first of all restructure this over multiple lines for all these components so that we have an easier time seeing which properties we're passing. And then let's say I don't even want to pass this for all the components, but only for this usage of it. So here, I will add a new property, which I'll name click. And the name is totally up to you. Here, I will pass a reference to this switch name handler. So basically what I also did here, this switch name handler on the click on the button, here I'm passing it as a reference to this click property. And now we can use this click property in person.js. There, I now can simply call props click, because click is the name of the property I defined here. And this will execute this function which I pass as a reference. So if we save all the files, app.js and person.js, we should see that in our application, we can of course still click this button to change the name of Maximilian and the age of Stephanie. But if I reload again, we can also click this paragraph with menu here. You also see it changed the name and the years. This is something important to understand, an important pattern. You can pass methods also as props, so that you can call a method which might change the state in another component which doesn't have direct access to the state and which shouldn't have direct access to the state. It's a common pattern and it's important to know. You can pass down click handlers which allow you to change the data in the parent component, in the app component in this case for the person component. Maybe we also want to pass a value to our function. Maybe here switch name handler should receive the new name. So that here where I hard-coded Maximilian as the new name, I actually set name equal to new name. Now, how do we pass that data? There are two ways of doing that. The first is that you call bind. Here you may simply bind this. This controls what this inside the function will refer to. And by binding it to this here outside of the function, we're binding it to the class. Might look strange, but is a typical way of handling the this issue in JavaScript. We wouldn't have need to do that though, but we can use this syntax because I also want to pass a second argument to bind. This now is a list of arguments actually, which will be passed into our function. And here, this should be the new name. So here, this could be Maximilian. And to really see a difference, let's copy that bind code. And let's also bind it down here when we pass the function as a reference to the click prop. And let's change this to max with an exclamation mark here so that we can see a difference depending on where we clicked. If we now save this with bind added and this received as an argument in the switch name handler, let's see what happens if I click switch name. I'm still changing it to Maximilian here, which makes sense because this is what I bound to, but that it works confirms that it works with receiving an argument. And if I click on the imenu paragraph, you see that it changed to max with an exclamation mark. So this is a way of passing an argument. It's not the only way though. I will leave one of the two code snippets here with bind to show you how this works. I'll also show you an alternative syntax though. So I'll leave bind here where we pass it as props, but we could use this new syntax I'm showing you now also down there. This new syntax looks different. Here, on click, I actually execute an arrow function, which takes no arguments, though theoretically it would receive an event object, by the way, but I won't use that here. And then simply, as a function body, returns this function call. Now here are a couple of things you have to understand. First of all, when using an arrow function, this implicitly adds a return keyword in front of the code which comes directly after the arrow if it's all written in one line. The alternative is to wrap this in curly braces and write a normal function body. So this gets returned. And what I return is a function call. This is why I added the parentheses. Now, in an earlier lecture, I said that you shouldn't call this, and that was true. But here, this is not getting executed immediately. Instead, what we pass here is an anonymous function, which will be executed on a click, and which then returns the result of this function getting executed, which of course simply leads to this function getting executed. This is useful because now here we can easily pass our data, Maximilian with 2 exclamation marks maybe. If I now save this and I click switch name, we see Maximilian with 2 exclamation marks. Now this is a very convenient syntax, but it can be inefficient. React can re-render certain things in your app too often. So I don't necessarily recommend using this if you don't have to. Use the bind syntax instead if you can. Still, I'll leave it here. You may use it, and depending on the size of your application, you also might not feel that big of a performance hit, but be aware that this can be inefficient.